Greetings all, and thank you for joining us on part 2 of this Road to Integration series. My name is Gabriella McDonald, and I am the Deputy Director of Texas Appleseed. And on behalf of the Appleseed Network, New York Appleseed, and Texas Appleseed, I welcome you to this Road to Integration, How Housing and Land Use Policies Impact School Segregation. Through this series, we hope to facilitate a national conversation about integration and what it truly looks like. In part 1 of this series, we talked about why schools and neighborhoods are still so segregated, focusing specifically on New York and Texas. We then had Dr. Jennifer Jellison Holm, Professor of Educational Policy and Planning in the Department of Education, Leadership, and Policy from the University of Texas at Austin, talk to us about the legal history of integration and the impact of regional approaches to school segregation and district inequality. Then we had 2 wonderful students from Integrate NYC, Kashawn Keller and Melanie Rosas Reyes, discuss what student involvement and investment in integration, as well as the 5 R's of real integration: race and enrollment, resources, relationships, restorative justice, and representation. You can check that conversation out on the Appleseed Network YouTube channel or on their Facebook page. Today, we're going to be talking about housing and land use as it relates to school segregation. To lay the most basic groundwork for the discussion, I just want to define what we mean when we say land use. And what we mean is regulations and rules that apply to where housing is placed, how different neighborhoods can be used, density, design, and historic preservation. And just zoning is a type of land use regulation. And some might ask, what does housing access and land use regulation have to do with school segregation? And the answer is everything. As our Director of Fair Housing and Disaster Recovery likes to say and remind us, housing segregation influences everything. And so government-backed policies and regulations have traditionally created and supported housing disparities that we see today, and that manifest in school segregation as well. So to turn it over to the experts, I want to start by introducing Texas Appleseed's Director of Education Justice, Andrew Hairston, who will serve as our moderator for today's discussion. Thank you so much. And Andrew, take it away.
Thank you so much, Gabriella, and similarly echo these sentiments of gratitude. Again, I'm Andrew Hairston. I direct the Education Justice Project at Texas Appleseed. I'm very honored to be with you all on this webinar today. I have the great honor of introducing our esteemed panelists. I'll start with Professor Lewis-McCoy. Professor Lewis-McCoy, also known as Dumi, is a sociologist whose scholarship and activism centers issues of race, education, and opportunity. He is an associate professor at New York University in the Sociology of Education program in the School of Culture, Education, and Human Development. In the area of education, he critically engages how educational resources and opportunities are hoarded. He is the author of Inequality in the Promised Land, published by Stanford University Press, which tackled how inequality persisted in an integrated, quote unquote, school and suburban community. His larger research interests include race and racism, gender justice, and community mobilization. He has lectured widely and has been a featured expert on the role of race in the contemporary political landscape, suburban and urban regional issues, as well as social justice. And we also have Kashana Hill with us. Kashana serves as the executive director of the Redress Movement, a Black-led, biracial, and multi-ethnic organization committed to leading a multiracial movement that empowers communities to take direct action to redress racial segregation. She previously served as executive director of one of the most active fair housing advocacy groups in the country, the Louisiana Fair Housing Action Center, where she led a team working holistically to end discriminatory housing policies and practices through litigation, policy advocacy, community-based educational offerings, and other direct services to community members. As an advocate, leader, and litigator with personal connections to the impacts of residential segregation and exclusionary housing policy, her work as executive director included leading the community engagement process for the City of New Orleans 2016 Assessment of Fair Housing Plan, the first in the nation submitted under a 2015 rule requiring state and local governments to identify and address barriers to fair housing choice. Kashana has written extensively about housing segregation and civil rights and has testified before the United States Congress as a fair housing expert. Beyond honored to have you both with us today. We'll start with Professor Lewis-McCoy and his presentation.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Gabrielle. And thank you to the whole Appleseed network for having me with you today. It's a pleasure to share and to kind of think through this question that you've kind of entitled or prompted us to the road of integration beginning in community, right? And one of the things that I want to do up front is help you understand how I think about these problems, right? Segregation is a central social feature of American life, right? By segregation, I mean the separation of two or more groups. It's often done legally, it's done by policy, it's done by institutional logic, but it is really the inheritance that people encounter when they are living in the United States. It's been something that has been calcified and become more solid over the years. And that segregation is really important to understand because when we're talking about something as what seems on its face as simple as housing choice or school choice, you're never simply choosing as if everything was an option. People are making constrained choices, and the choices that they make are often tied to the folks that came before them. So it's not just you choosing where you live, but it's you choosing where you live based in part on the experiences that came from your parents or your grandparents and the kind of accumulation of advantage that has happened there, right? And so segregation sets the stage for us. But I also want to make a distinction here between what I often call desegregation and integration. Desegregation is absolutely attacking those barriers, both formal and informal, that separate two or more groups. It is really pushing to make sure resources reach the communities that have been historically disenfranchised, contemporarily marginalized, or the subjects of systematic racism and erasure. And then really integration is a third part, but you can only get to integration if you've desegregated resources. Integration looks like the psychosocial interaction between us. It looks like when we actually have families and communities that have a diversity of experiences who co-create the meaning of neighborhood and co-create the meaning of a good school. And I would often say and challenge folks, you probably haven't seen integration yet. In fact, what we've often done is started to walk up towards desegregation and then get pushed back on. And so my comments today are framed knowing that we have a goal of having a whole community, of being a community, but there are some things that undergird us and really push against that. By way of background, I specialize in studying the suburbs. And as Andrew mentioned, I often study what people have defined as integrated spaces. My first question is, to what degree do low-income students, Black students, Latinx students experience the spoils of suburbia? Now, the suburbs themselves are not a naturally occurring phenomenon. They came about by concerted policy and efforts to create a separate set of lands and a separate set of opportunities. And as people moved away from the city, those who had resources, first, those who had money and those who were white, and then second, in the 1970s and 1980s, those who were Black and had resources, as they fled to suburban spaces, they sought new opportunities. But one of the things that we know is whether you're in the middle of a city like New York, or you're out in the suburbs of Westchester County, or you're in a rural area, racism follows, classism follows. And so in my book, Inequality in the Promised Land, one of the things I talk about is the phenomenon of opportunity hoarding, which is the idea that if there's a thing that is valuable, that people desire, that people will start to circle around it and limit access for others. And what I found in suburban schools that were said to be integrated was often Black students and poor students didn't have access to the same teachers, to the same curriculum, to the same neighborhoods, though while many of our measures of segregation would say, this is the promised land, within that space, students and families were experiencing large degrees of racial harm, large degrees of erasure, and ultimately those spaces that many have been questing for didn't actually turn out to be the places that they wanted. The last comment I'll make now is that I've turned my work in New York and Westchester County to look at not only how opportunity hoarding functions, but how people fight back against phenomena like opportunity hoarding. And my work in New Rochelle has helped me understand what it looks like on the ground to try to resist the logics of segregation, to resist the push to disconnect people. So New Rochelle, for those who are unfamiliar, is right outside of New York City. It's a well-appointed suburb. It's a pretty nice place. And as I started to attend school board meetings and talk to people about the process of becoming a community, I heard the issue of busing come up. And we often talk about busing and think about people moving from one side of town to the other, from low income to high income or across boundaries. But this was an issue within the community. The community had long been, the busing had been structured around distance from a school. And if you were a certain distance from a school, you were able to access buses. But if you were shorter distance, you weren't allowed to. What I found was increasingly, as New Rochelle developed, its walkability declined. And so low income students and Black students who lived closer to schools were actually ineligible to ride the bus, which increased their hazard of safety, right? So traveling down what had now become major thoroughfares to make it to school. And I saw parents starting to ring the alarm and sound the alarm about this busing issue that was local, but often overlooked. And in that process, I saw people who were middle income, I saw people who were affluent, people who literally were able to send their kids to school with a driver who started to ring the bell and sound the alarm and say, look, this is an issue of safety. This is an issue of community. And if we don't start to address this, we may not actually have the beautiful, diverse community that we desire. So I look forward to talking about kind of some of the national landscape. I know that my co-panelists will break that down far better than I ever can. But I also look forward to talking about local stories about how we create the worlds we want to live in. Thank you.
Thank you for that fascinating background, Professor. And Kashawn, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Really excited and honored to be here today with you all and to have this conversation. And I think I very much agree with what we just heard from Professor Lewis-McCoy. And I think, if I think about this work, I certainly do take a localized perspective as well. Although the redress movement is a national organization, the work that we do is deeply rooted in community, right? And we work in support of communities that are determining and want to determine, right, sort of the outcomes and figure out how to have better outcomes that really do work to remediate the harms of segregation. But the work is informed by the experiences that Black and Brown people are having in communities all across the country. And so, I came to this conversation at the starting place of, wow, is this a question, right? That housing and land use policies impact the way that our school systems work. I think based on my experience as a longtime civil rights and fair housing lawyer, I'm very clear, right, that the conversations are really inextricably linked, and you can't really sort of have an understanding of the impacts of housing segregation without being very clear on the impacts of school segregation. And then you also can't understand school segregation without being very clear about this country's past and present, sometimes history of racist and discriminatory housing policy, right? And so I think we actually do ourselves a disservice when we talk about these issues separately. And so to the extent that we're going to have these conversations, I think we have to be very clear about how, as the professor noted, right, so often choices are not just choices, right? And we know particularly that for Black and Brown families, right, choices are incredibly limited and have been limited not only by the experiences and the access that past generations had to opportunity, but by policies that are in place in the housing and land use zone that really continue to limit the choices that folks have as it relates to opportunity and what is best for their families. So I think something else that it's important to be very clear about here, right, is just the lasting impacts that a commitment to white supremacy is continuing to have in our school systems across the country, as well as in our housing policy. And so something that it feels very important to note, right, is that we often have these conversations about how can we get our school systems to look differently, or how can we deal with school segregation that remains prevalent across the country, right? So many years after the Supreme Court's Brown versus Board of Education decision, I think about my parents who were born in 1955 and 1956, right? The year after and 2 years after that decision came down. And I haven't talked to my parents about this, but I'm guessing that they never expected to hear, right, as kids who were growing up and who were tasked with integrating school system or schools in the very white community of Portland, Oregon. My parents, who are in their late 60s, I think never expected that our schools would, 69 years after the decision, would look the way that they look now, right? And so I think we have to be clear that the actions that we are taking in communities and the preferences, right, of people with resources and of folks who are in power, those preferences and those commitments, right, to the opportunity hoarding, they have a lot to do with the ways that the school systems look. And so to the extent that people with resources aren't going to make different choices, right, and actually see themselves as active participants in the fight for school integration, then we're going to continue to struggle, right, and sort of be stuck in this loop. And so I'm here to share stories from community, but also to be very clear about the fact that folks with resources, right, certainly have a stake in this fight and have, frankly, a large bit of responsibility when it comes to the continued perpetuation of school segregation.
I'm so grateful to you both for the brilliance and the passion that you bring to this work. And thank you so much for sharing those introductory remarks. We can dive right in. We have a few questions that we wrote out and invite any thoughts that y'all have. There's no question that land use and housing regulations have been weaponized to push for and promote segregation. Can you provide us with some examples of what that has looked like? Are there ways to turn that around and use land use and housing regulations to promote and support integration?
I don't know if we have an order for.
Okay. You got it. You got the lead. I'll follow.
Okay, thanks. So I think I think it's just at the outset, right, sort of important to just note that school systems are made up, right, of, typically speaking, the families who live in those communities, right? And I think here's where we start to enter with what I consider to be disingenuousness, right? Oftentimes when we have these conversations and it's just, oh, well, the school system looks this way because the community looks this way. And I think we actually got that reasoning from Chief Justice John Roberts in a Supreme Court decision, right? That allowed the challenge of desegregation orders. I'm trying to remember if that was Louisville or if it was Seattle. But the reasoning there, right, was, well, the school system is segregated and it looks this way because this is how the community looks. Okay, if that's where the conversation ends, then we're not taking any real interest, right, in solving the problem. We're being very disingenuous if that's how we're engaging in the conversation. So why does the community look that way, right? And I want us to consider, right, that local elected officials are making decisions specifically designed to keep school systems looking a certain way. And I think to Professor Lewis-McCoy's point, we see these decisions being made, again, because of the opportunity hoarding, right? So if I think about the community in which I grew up, I went to high school in East Cobb County, which is in the northern Atlanta suburbs, an incredibly white, very wealthy, conservative, politically conservative community. When I was growing up, my congressional representative was Newt Gingrich, okay? And so this is the community in which I grew up. Now, I went to a high school and graduated from a high school in 1998, 25 years ago, that was 98% white. Okay. And we're talking about a community, 30 minutes outside of majority Black Atlanta. right? It wasn't a mistake that my high school was 98% white. And we continue to see local elected officials making zoning decisions in particular that would keep it that way. So in that community school system, there was one school, it wasn't majority Black, but there was one school that had the highest population of Black students. And I would say back then it was about 30% Black, I believe. And even as a teenager, right, I noticed, well, there's something going on here. Everybody that goes to this school lives in a big single family home. Now, we did have some classmates who were renters, but I wouldn't have known that then. There were very specific decisions made to ensure that folks who needed to live in multifamily housing, right, apartments, they weren't zoned to go to that school. So all of the multifamily housing, the only multifamily housing in the community was zoned, right, for the school that had the highest population of Black folks. And again, that population was never majority Black, but it was always very clear, right, that if there was ever going to be any multifamily housing built in that part of Cobb County, it was in this particular neighborhood, right, that was zoned to go toward this one high school. And that was why we continue to see, right, very limited access to any other kinds of housing for folks who had lower incomes. And so there was also no zoning that would allow for multifamily housing in the school system that in the high school area that I attended. So if there's only, one area where we're allowing multifamily housing and we're going to continue to funnel all of the students in those families into this one high school, then nothing ever changes, right? And we would hear, I remember reading in the paper when there were when there was legislation or ordinances being debated around public transit, right? You would hear local elected officials saying, if folks can't afford to have a car, they don't need to be out here. We don't want that public transit out here because we don't want those folks from Atlanta having access to this community, right? And so all of this opposition to multifamily housing, to public transit, right? It all works together to keep communities separated and to keep opportunities present for one group of people. And so I just want to be very clear that none of this is a mistake. And we have choices about whether or not we are going to continue to perpetuate the inequity or whether we are going to make choices that fight the inequity.
Wonderful, wonderful articulation. I think as we think about the relationship between housing and school zones, it's important to first say that school zones were drawn almost arbitrarily. That is, there is no tried and true method. Now, they weren't drawn arbitrarily because, as my co-panelist has already mentioned, they were drawn to make sure certain sets of students stayed together and other sets of students didn't have access. And so when I think about how zoning laws and housing laws have been used, they've often been used to concentrate affluence and to concentrate poverty. We also have had a number of programs that have been rolled back over the decades in the United States. Famously, the Milliken case in metropolitan Detroit eliminated the ability of to bus children across suburb and city lines, even when people were willing. So one of the things that's very dangerous is that we may have a desire as a community, but the jurisprudence may say, well, you can't actually do that. Now, I think there are ways to work around and think creatively about it. But for many folks, the idea of running up against legal challenge, it pushes them away from actually doing the work of bringing things together. I also want to highlight things that we deal with, such as snob zoning. And what is snob zoning? It's a kind of zoning that my co-panelist, Kashana Hill, was mentioning. It's the idea that we want to build a community, but we don't want that community to have affordable housing. We don't want that community to have multiple family units. And so in places like Long Island, in places like Massachusetts, in places like nearly anywhere where there's affluence, there becomes this emphasis on single family homes. And in some places, passing ordinances that bar the idea that multiple families can be in the same home. And what that does is it, again, keeps away lower income folks, and it makes communities have a particular demographic, a money demographic. And when you lay that on top of racial residential segregation, knowing that Black and Latinx folks who are searching for homes are steered to different communities by realtors, despite the idea that we have laws that prevent it, but systematically are steered away. We find ourselves in a place where our zoning and our housing regulation and our sets of choices are constrained to recreate the system we already have. When we think about which schools you see and which homes you see, there's a whole universe of schools and homes that you don't see, sometimes by design of history, right? So creating those boundaries, and other times by literal contemporary processes of steering you out of neighborhoods that they don't want you in, or neighborhoods that they have argued will lose value if they diversify.
We're doing pretty good on time for this webinar, but I'm about to take a privilege and extend it for 2 hours because this is the best. This is the best convection.
I don't know if I can make it 2 hours.
Right, it's going to be Andrew.
Thank y'all so much for sharing. Now, in this work, and this has come up in your remarks so far, there seems to be a perennial tension since policy decisions in this arena have so far resulted in white communities having more resources, that there's an implied suggestion that Black people and other people of color should move into communities to have access to better schools. How have you responded to that in your work?
I'll take the lead on this one, Shauna, and I'm sure you'll follow. So overwhelmingly, what I remind folks of is, at this point in my career, I have interviewed hundreds and hundreds of families of color. And I'm talking in the Midwest, I'm talking in the Northeast, I'm talking all around the country. And I'm going to tell you something honestly. Less than 5 interviews have ever said, you know what I want to do? Live in a white neighborhood. That should be very telling to us. Repeatedly, I hear people talk about wanting good schools, safe communities, access to transportation, green spaces. But what they don't say is, like, magically, if I were to move to a white community, things would be fine. Now, the things that get concentrated and have been hoarded in white communities, surely people desire access to that, right? But I think we are also, as we come up on the 70th anniversary of Brown, and I echo here Derek Bell in some sense, the separate and unequal that came out of Plessy versus Ferguson, there's been a large discussion of the separate, but not really a significant discussion of the unequal, right? Imagine if for 70 years, we had listened to the voices of people who have been the subjects of the most vicious forms of racism, classism, and segregation, and said, what do you need? What does your community need? And they would say, we need strong schools. We need ample resources, not just equal, but disproportionate, right? Progressive policy. We need actual housing units that align with our lives and our needs. We need jobs that are close. What if we had 70 years of investment in those communities from a federal level? Could we even imagine what it would look like? Instead, what has happened is we've had very patchwork investment in communities, and then we have, whether intentionally or not, we've advocated a lot for movement. So when we uplift things like moving to opportunity, the Gautreaux experiment, in which people receive a voucher and they move to another place and they have positive outcomes, we say, there's a solution, if only they could move. Well, the danger in this is that we know everyone can't just up and move. We also know that when you dig into the benefits that people experience, there are also different valences for Black boys, of people of certain ages, right? And different people of working age. Those things have to be considered. So what I always say to this question of, this is really, how do we move more poor Black and brown people to well-to-do areas? I say, no, that's not the first order of business. In fact, it's only the first order of business if you don't actually listen to the voices of the people who are most impacted by the systems that you claim to care about.
Yeah, thank you for that. So, you know, gosh, so this question is always a tough one for me. And I always start with this very question is why we need to be really listening to the voices of Black and brown folks that are doing this work, right? And I say this as someone who has been, you know, a fair housing lawyer for, you know, the entirety of my career. And, I certainly understand, right, like the benefits of voucher mobility programs, for instance, as the professor was just discussing, and frankly, I'm very proud of the fact that the Louisiana Fair Housing Action Center within the past year has partnered with the Housing Authority of New Orleans to provide supportive services for voucher holding families who are looking to move into different communities, right? Really wanted to be able to get into that work and offer that service for community members. But I think it's important here for this conversation to be nuanced, right? And the people who have had these experiences are the people who understand the very intricate and important nuances of this conversation. So I think we have to be clear that there are families, and particularly when we're talking about families with vouchers, there are absolutely, families who would choose, right, to move into neighborhoods that are well resourced if given the opportunity, right? We can't deny that. And those folks should have the ability to be able to do that. However, we also know that that's not an option for everyone. Certainly not space, right, enough for everyone to be able to move to a different community, but also folks may not be interested in leaving their social networks or their families or their schools, right? And so really what is critical, right, is being clear that investment, right, in communities that have been starved of investment has to happen, as well as folks having the ability to actually choose to move to a different neighborhood if they so desire. But I think what's really important here, as we heard from Professor Lewis-McCoy, is the lack of equality, right? I have I've not interviewed, for scholarly purposes, hundreds of families, but I've talked to a whole lot of Black folks. And what I will say is that even Black folks, right, who and people that I know or have worked with who are living in majority white neighborhoods, very often I hear from people, if I could have access to these same amenities, I may not have made the choice to live in this community. I think we have to be clear that there are trade-offs, right, when we make those decisions to place, in particular, Black folks in white communities, or when Black folks do decide to move into white communities, there are absolutely trade-offs that we have to make. I think often about what my mom experienced. My mom is 68 years old. She's 67. And she attended elementary school under a mandatory busing program in Portland, Oregon in the 1960s. So starting in second grade, my mom and her two sisters were bused to a majority white high school. It was a traumatic experience, okay? Having to, having fistfights in elementary school because people didn't want you there, right? Like having children and adults throwing rocks at you as a 7-year-old, right? Because people don't want you in that community. Her experience was such that when the time for high school came and the busing for her stopped being mandatory and she could then choose where she wanted to attend high school, she instantly made the choice to attend the majority Black high school in her neighborhood, right? Now, on the other side of things, my dad was not bused in elementary or middle schools, but busing for him began in high school, and it was voluntary, and he had the choice, right, to decide whether he wanted to stay and go to the majority Black high school or whether he wanted to be bused. And one of the things that my dad was clear about, right, based on conversations with his grandparents who raised him, was that they didn't know what the white students, right, at that school had access to, but they knew they had access to something that my dad's family did not have access to, right? And so my dad made the decision, and he certainly experienced difficulties, but for him felt that the trade-off was worth it. My dad is a college graduate, my mother is not, and within our family, we're very clear, and it feels pretty clear that my dad had access to the tools to get him, right, like to a college education because of the opportunity hoarding, right, that was present within the white high school that he attended. And so because I had the lessons, right, behind those nuances ingrained in me, I come to this work with a very full and comprehensive and clear understanding about the trade-offs, right, that folks have to face when they're making these decisions. And it's not fair. And so I think that understanding of that nuance and those trade-offs is really part of what drives my commitment to this work. Because I really hope that future generations don't continue to have to grapple with these things. And we're certainly not there yet, right? We all know that Black and brown families in particular across the country are having to make these decisions every day, particularly Black and brown families with some resources, right, are finding themselves in that same position of, do we stay within segregated public schools that are majority Black or brown if we live in communities of color? Or do we move the family, right, to, or start a family in communities that are well resourced, but where folks don't look like us? And I hope that we won't have to continue to grapple with this question, because as a society, we could make different decisions that will not require that families continue to have to think this way about schools and school choice.
Can I veg you back really quickly on Kashana's comments, which are absolutely brilliant, and I agree that nuance is so necessary and often missed. Keep in mind also that out of all groups of people, Black people have the highest levels of preference for diverse or integrated or non-majority white spaces out of any group, right? That is not the case for all groups, right? So when I think about the possibilities, particularly of Black folks who tend to be hardest hit by segregation, there's a desire to have options and choices between quality goods. And the importance of having a full community with diverse values and beliefs is that, yeah, some folks are going to decide to move and go to the school that someone's like, well, why would you go there? And other folks are going to decide to say, but when you have a choice between quality goods, not just choice, between quality goods, we have a very different conversation.
Exactly. And that's what we're missing, right? The equality is just not there. And so people are being forced to make choices when that are sort of, artificial in many respects, right?
That we shouldn't have to make.
Exactly. We shouldn't have to make them. And people's choices are not based on equality of circumstances, unfortunately.
Boy, rich exchange. Y'all have both uplifted that 2024 represents a watershed moment. I've been thinking about this in my education work at Texas Appleseed. So we have the 70th anniversary of Brown v. Board, and then the 25th anniversary of Columbine. And I've particularly been thinking about how school safety policies and school integration policies have failed Black folks largely. And what are y'all thinking as we go into 2024? Do you think that these anniversaries offer inflection points for us to expand this conversation around desegregation and school integration and the policy recommendations that come behind both of them?
I'm going to be super brief here. I haven't been brief yet. I don't know. I think this is where we have to get honest with ourselves, right? I've been thinking a lot about how so much of policy in this country, particularly around race and access, it involves a certain level of gaslighting, right? We're pretending that things aren't as they are. We're pretending that what's happening isn't happening. And we're making policy that comes out of nowhere and is based on something that isn't reality, right? So in terms of your point about a watershed sort of moment and what 2024 can look like, I mean, in order to move the needle on, either of these things you just mentioned, school segregation and school safety, we have to stop pretending like what is happening isn't happening. We have to stop pretending. And I don't know that as a country, we're ready to stop pretending about a whole bunch of things yet. So that's where I will leave it and turn it over to the professor.
No, I agree. I wish that we could face hard truths and tell hard truths and come to better solutions. Instead, every couple of years, we have kind neighbors who say to us, like, this isn't the America that I knew. And I'm like, well, which one did you know? Where were you at? This one's been pretty consistent, right? With that being said, we're coming up on the 7th anniversary. I want to tell you, this is and I'm not going to be, I'm going to be brief. After the 60th anniversary, a couple years ago, I was invited by a friend who's a teacher in the Bronx to visit her class. And she said, you study schools, you study race, you study opportunity. Can you come talk to my kids about the Brown decision? And it was during Black History Month, so I gladly obliged. And I went into this classroom in New York City Public School in the Bronx, high concentrations of immigrant students, high concentrations of Black students and Brown students. And I talked about the Brown decision, and then I got to the question and answer. And I think it was about 2nd grade, and one of the students raised their hand and they were like, "Mister, I have a question." I was like, "Sure, what's the question?" And the child was like, "I thought you told me we won the Brown case. I thought you said schools can't be segregated." And then she just motioned to the room. There wasn't a white face in the room. And it was at that moment where I was like, ooh, right? I'm a sociologist, and let me be clear, I'm throwing stones in a glass house. Half of our career and 3/4 of it is made in documenting inequality. I know folks who are working on their 70th anniversary papers on segregation right now. But if we document it and we document it and we document it and do nothing about it, what are we doing? It only becomes a watershed moment if we are actually moved to action and really pull in folks who haven't been central to the conversation and offer a different set of challenges and solutions than what we have before. So for me, the potential exists, but only if everyone, the folks who may be in this webinar, the folks who are in communities really say, who's been missing from this conversation? And what am I willing to give up? Sometimes it's giving up your frame. You thought this was a solution. This was the only way. Sometimes it's giving up your control of the room and the dialogue. But there has to be something that is given up. There have to be different voices, and we have to push in a different way. Or else the anniversary of Brown will be like the anniversary of Columbine, and we'll find ourselves 20 years down the line looking at more militarized schools that are more harmful to children and more segregation, and we'll have more commemorative reports.
And unfortunately, that's where I see us going. I'm just gonna say.
Yeah. We have a few questions from the chat. One is, can y'all explain the difference between single family and multiple family homes?
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that question, and I probably should have explained that earlier. So thank you for asking. But single family houses just refers to a house where a family can live. Now we all know that sometimes more than one family is going to live in a quote unquote single family home, right? But if you think about a house that has 3 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms, that's a single family house, right? Just a house for a family. Multi-family housing, an apartment complex is an example of multi-family housing, right? So a big, doesn't have to be sprawling, but some sort of housing for more than one family. It could be a duplex, we call them doubles here in New Orleans. It could be a triplex or a building that has 4 apartments in it, but just multifamily housing is anything other than just, a quote unquote regular house.
Yeah. And then one more question from the audience. Can y'all share thoughts based on interviews or conversations on the implications for the Black and Latino or Latina families and students who are left behind when folks either decide to move out or their communities for better schools or use vouchers?
That's an interesting framing. And Olga, I'll tell you why it's interesting, because I haven't encountered folks kind of seeing themselves as left behind. Oftentimes folks who don't opt to move, who aren't given the option, it's kind of business as usual, right? This is the neighborhood that I grew up in, that my mama grew up in. So like, this is what I expect. So I haven't experienced a lot of like disappointment or regret around folks who have been left behind. That's not to say that there may not be those spaces or some antagonisms that exist, but oftentimes it's literally folks who are still very committed, like, hey, how do I make this place where I live better? I want to be able to go to work and have my kids go to school and come home and then be safe at school, safe walking home, and for us to be able to have dinner together. It's the same fundamental desires that I think often motivate folks who do get the option to move, right? We're motivated around community. We're motivated around security. Not in the sense like we need like surveillance and those things, but the idea of like, if I could relax and not have to juggle so many things, that would be amazing. Because oftentimes the folks that are left behind are remaining in segregated neighborhoods that are not just segregated by house, but they're distant from jobs, they're disconnected from quality public transportation, or there's a high cost of commute, and these are things that keep you from living your life in a fuller and a better way, I would argue.
Yeah, I appreciate that, because I actually also, I've never encountered a Black or brown person who felt that they had been left behind, right, by family members making the decision to, or community members making the decision to move to a different community. What I will say, similar to what we just heard from Professor Lewis-McCoy, is that there is typically, I think, a continuing life, right, as normal, but also still a commitment and a desire to making sure that the neighborhood receives the investment, right, that it should. And so again, I think here, what I typically find from people who are dealing with, the loss of community members to other neighborhoods that are more well-resourced, is just, again, the understanding that the lack of equity, right, is the issue here. Gosh, I mean, when I have these conversations with Black folks in New Orleans, for instance, they don't begrudge anybody who has made the decision to move to a different community, but they are still going to continue to work to demand resources within their own community. So that's the framing that I've experienced versus the left behind framing. And I did want to just say, just kind of popped into my head that I should mention with regard to single family and multifamily housing. So kind of just quickly back to that, is that if folks aren't aware, generally speaking, zoning rules have to allow for the building of multifamily housing. Now, there's a bunch of zoning regulations I'm not going to get into, but just in case folks don't have this foundational kind of knowledge for the conversation, there are certain kinds of buildings that can be built in certain communities based on how the community is zoned. So there are a couple of cities across the country that don't have any zoning laws. I think Houston is a city famously where there's no zoning, but Houston is still incredibly segregated. That's a topic for another day. But typically speaking, a community might be zoned for residential development or commercial development. And in communities where residential development is allowed, right, so housing can be built in that community, there's generally never any permission that's needed to you don't generally have to get any permission to build single family housing, right? Like any residentially zoned community will accept the building of like a single family house. But in many communities across the country, there are limits to where multifamily housing, right, apartment complexes can be built. And so my point in talking about multifamily housing is that in many communities, particularly where there are wealthy folks or folks who have a lot of resources and the communities are well resourced, if those communities allow any multifamily housing at all, they will very often allow it in a particular area, right? And then all of the students from that area where multifamily housing is allowed are being zoned into a specific set of schools. And so I just wanted to close that loop there in case it wasn't very clear earlier.
And can I uplift one small bit of policy? So in Massachusetts, for example, they have passed an anti-snob law provision, which means if you're in a often suburban, affluent place that doesn't have affordable housing and it's less than 10%, you get to fast track and you can create affordable housing that sidesteps oftentimes the people who create the barriers. So the idea is that you would be able to create affordable housing because there's a demand and a need. And historically, this area has blocked out affordable housing. So there is some movement, and not to say the legislation is not without challenge or flaws, but I think it's important that there are some folks who are creatively trying to address this too.
Yeah. I will have a quick final question, and then I'll pass it to my colleagues, Maddie and Naya. Do y'all find differentiations even within single family communities? That is, differences in the sizes of the houses, the families occupying the home, and do those differences correlate to race?
The short answer is absolutely, right? And the census ends up being good for helping us kind of parse that out. But in my own work, I've seen in particular, it correlates to race, in particular Latinx families, and also recent immigrant communities across different ethnic backgrounds tend to double and triple up in homes or have intergenerational homes. And there are often challenges around school attendance and boundaries based on what place kids call home, right? So I may be living with my grandmama and my auntie, but now all of a sudden the district has put out a private investigator because they're like, you can't live two places. When in fact, people live two places and with multiple families and in complicated ways, because that's called life.
Agree. And yes, the answer is yes in my own work and frankly personal experience as well. Yeah, absolutely. Differences, I again to the point of, and this is what white supremacy and like opportunity hoarding do, right? It's you're constantly looking for ways to differentiate. The people who have don't want to give up. Right. And so we oftentimes see that even when people of color have made it into, quote unquote, those communities, right, they're still, the folks who were already there are still looking for ways to differentiate. I mean, I've worked with families who are, sharing stories of their kids being asked, well, does your family rent? Or, do you have a voucher? And it's like, this is what they're being asked in 8th or 9th grades or whatever, because again, trying to differentiate, right? Just think about, I mean, we've all seen this in movies and stuff, but I think we, probably have friends who may have experienced this, but the kids who are maybe from low income families who go to private school, right? I have numerous friends who have attended private school, whether it's, boarding schools or very prestigious private schools here in New Orleans, whatever the case may be. But lots and lots of stories of Black and brown kids being asked, are you on scholarship? Right. So that scenario kind of plays out in the housing context, right? In these very well-resourced communities, it does play out in that way as well, for sure.
Ooh, thank you. I'll give you more notes of gratitude here, but for now, I'll pass it to Naya and Maddie for a call to action.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to tack on to that gratitude. I didn't know whether to just like watch y'all, take notes, get some quotes. Like there was a lot going on. So I'm glad that this is live, but that we're also recording so that folks that miss this can hear it back, because there's so many valuable nuggets of information that are incredibly important. So thank you. Really quickly for us, Maddie and I wanted to quickly talk about a letter that we had moved forward, but also how we thought about breaking down silos and working between the intersection of housing and schools. And one of the recent opportunities that came up was a proposed rule for AFFH, so affirmatively furthering fair housing. First of all, we really want to go through AFFH. We don't want to have alphabet soup. So what is it? That stands for Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing. It is under the Fair Housing Act. This is a required mandate by the U.S. Department of Housing that essentially says that government policy that we just, heard a lot about, but government policy created and perpetuated segregation and inequality, and therefore it is the government's responsibility and obligation to fix it. And communities that accept public money, that accept federal dollars, not only have to refrain from discriminating, but have to take an affirmative step to overcome segregation and that historical divestment. In theory, there should be an asterisk there. That is an in theory, but I'll pass it over to Maddie to talk about how we hope to change this in theory piece of AFFH to actually holding some teeth that we are excited about in the proposed rule that just occurred in 2023. Maddie, I think you're on mute.
Oops, I'm sorry, Al. We're supporting this rule because it, emphasizes some of the things we've talked about right now, the balanced approach, not just pushing for mobility, holds communities responsible and accountable for what they are doing and what they are doing in particular with public money, and really presents some new and expanded opportunities for community engagement. Now, the rule isn't final yet, so you may be wondering, why are we telling you about this rule and this new process of equity planning that HUD wants communities to do to prove they're eligible for federal money? One is that this obligation is already in the law. It's been in the law since 1968 in the Fair Housing Act. So communities are already obligated to do some form of looking at what the barriers to opportunity and access to resources and desegregation are, and to make plans around addressing them. So it may not be the kind of process we really want to see with the kinds of accountability that the new rule puts in place, but it's there. It's a place to get involved and to push. And the other reason is this is a great example of ways to get involved and really push your community to recognize the real problems and real issues, and to push for solutions that are meaningful to communities themselves. It's not just planners in a room saying, hey, this is what we think should happen, but communities saying, no, we don't want to have to move. We want more green space here. We want multifamily housing in this neighborhood, and we want more green space in this neighborhood. And as we've discussed, school integration is a huge piece of that. And I will turn it back over to Gabriella to close, I think.
So much for that, Maddie and Naya. I really, really cannot thank Professor Lewis-McCoy and Kashana Hill for the conversation that they had with Andrew today. This was incredible, incredibly informative, something you should share with friends and family and neighbors as you talk about these issues. And we just want to share with you all a couple of resources that we think will be of interest to you based on your interest in this conversation today. And after this webinar is over, we will send it out to those of you who registered for the event. But we have Professor Lewis-McCoy's book link. We also have a article that was done by the Louisiana Fair Housing Action Center, which Kashana Hill is part of prior to her new position that she has now, called Delayed Until Downsized in Detail, talking about neighborhood associations and the ways that they do often delay building things like multifamily housing in places and perpetuate segregation. The third link is a Adam Ruins Everything discussion that really is something you can share with people who have never thought about these issues before. And then last but not least, as for those who are interested in learning more about the affirmatively furthering fair housing work and rule, there is a link there for HUD's information and more resources in that link itself. Thank you so much for joining us for this. We will look forward to talking with you all again in a couple of months for our webinar number 3 that will discuss new methods to uphold segregation. And our final webinar, number 4, will be building welcoming and inclusive environments in schools. So thank you so much, and hope you all have a wonderful weekend.